Okay. So today we're going to talk about another book. And we're recording this so we can put it up on the Facebook page so that people who aren't here can get it or refer to it. So this is the general idea of these book reviews, is to offer a lot of kin without people having to read them all. And I read this for the second time, and I started 3 or 4 days ago, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, it's 400 pages. Lynn, you need to move right along here. So I feel utterly immersed in Ken and Treya. I kind of lived with them for the last 2 or 3 days, and I feel like I'm in their world. And I think my goal here today is to get through this without crying, but we'll see if I can do that or not. All right, so I want to start out talking just briefly about the place and the development of the theory. This book was published in 1991. It was actually written in, I think, 89 or something like that. You can see that Wilber moved from Wilber 3 to Wilber 4, different phases of his philosophy during this time. And you can see in the book, in a way, some of the development of this theory moving from the way he talks about the levels and the lines of development. In 87, it was still like the spectrum of consciousness, his early way of seeing it, and then he gradually moved into a different way. So this book is technically in Wilber 4, but it has a lot in it of Wilber 3, for those of you who are interested in these kinds of details. So just an overview of the book. It actually has 4 threads running through it. It's a very complex book, and it's a little difficult to review because of that, because he shifts from one thread to another thread as he goes through. The first thread is Treya's illness, and along with that, an analysis of medicine and culture in the world that they find themselves in. Another thread is their relationship, what happened to them, and how this all affected them, and how, their love and that kind of thing. The third one is the individual personal healing they each did as they went through this. So we have her journals, and we have his comments and his experiences, and you can see the shifts that they made. And then another part of the book is a direct expression of integral theory. And he does that either through conversations between them, once an interview with another person, and just his writing about the theory. And there's a dream. There's a dream that threads its way through, and it's a very kind of strange dream. And I won't touch on that, because I won't, because I think you sort of just have to read that. It's a very, dreamlike sequence. So in the preface, Wilber says this book offers explanations of the great wisdom traditions, the nature of meditation, the relation of psychotherapy to spirituality, and the nature of health and healing. Indeed, the main purpose of this book is to provide an accessible introduction to these topics. Now, that may be true, but I have to say the story overwhelms the theory, in my opinion. So a little bit about the relationship. They met August 3rd, 1983. She called it love at first touch, that they hugged, and then they were that was it. They decided to get married within 2 weeks. She was 36 at the time, he was 35. He had written Spectrum of Consciousness already. To do that, he had cut short his doctorate, taken a master's, and he worked washing dishes and ordering vast numbers of books and reading them. He then went to work in Cambridge. This is something I had sort of not remembered, on a magazine called Revision with Jack Crittenden. And he left there and went back to Tiburon, California, to live with Francis Vaughan and Roger Walsh, Roger Walsh is still very, very active in the integral community. In fact, he's speaking at our Spanish conference in June, and Francis died, I think, just last year. Anyway, he left Cambridge because everybody thought he'd love it because he's so intellectual, oh, you're just going to think. And he said, no, he said, people seem to confuse the sound of grinding teeth with thinking. So you'll see his sense of humor shows up in this book a lot. So at the time they meet, she's in school doing a master's at the Integral Institute for something or other in California. I can't remember the exact word. And he was in the middle of writing quantum questions, which we did here a little while ago. So they had 4 months to get ready for their wedding, which was on November 26th. And this is the time that he says they really had a chance to get to know each other, really. So 4 weeks before they're married, she discovers a lump, doesn't think anything of it, thinks it's, she thinks it's just a cyst. But she finally sees somebody who's a little concerned and says the lump should come out. And it was, so they got married. 10 days later, she had the lump out, and it turned out to be malignant, stage 4, very fast growing, very aggressive. So here they are, they can't go on their honeymoon. She has what's called a segmental mastectomy, a portion of the breast is removed, and she has a drainage tube inserted. So she then goes home and within a few days finds, well, they take the drainage tube out. She then finds 2 more spots on her right breast where the drainage tube was. And apparently what happened is when they removed the drainage tube, some cells remained. They were radiation resistant because she had already had radiation. So they could not remove these cells by radiation. So not a very good situation to find herself in. So now we shift to the philosophy, and I'm just going to put a heading when we've shifted from one to the other. They spend a lot of time talking about meditation and awareness. She herself has been a meditator for many years, and he, of course, as we know, has been involved in his own practice. So on page 100, for those of you who are interested, there's like a reader's digest of his book that he's writing, Transformations of Consciousness. And he talks about the development of the witness self and the developmental stages. And he looks at each stage, and he looks at the pathology that can occur at each stage and at the type of treatment that is best suited for each stage. And he mentions that this is the last book that he would write for 4 years. So here is a graph of what he writes about, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, particularly since if you look at the left side of the graph, the stages of development have shifted. So this is still a Wilber 3 look at the stages, and later he shifts them. You can see where he says psychic, subtle, causal. Those are no longer, though he separated those into the Wilber-Combs lattice. So he says that the spirituality develops on a different axis than growing up does. At first he put the spiritual stages on top, like when you get to be spiritual you're more advanced, but then he realized no, you can be spiritual, you can have an enlightenment experience at any stage of development. So you can have a very, very low stage of development, have an enlightenment experience, and then translate that into whatever mental structure you have at the time, which is often very distorted and that kind of thing. So he shifts that, but anyway, there are different types of therapies and things like that that are offered for each of these. So then we go back here to the illness. So I made a copy of pages 46 and 47. I don't want to stop to go through all this at the moment, but it's very significant, and I'll hand it out later. He talks about all of the different ways that illness is defined in our society. So he mentions the Christian view of illness, the holistic view of illness, the magical view of illness, the existential view, the karma. So I've made a copy of this, and I'll hand it out. In the end, I thought we might have a look at several of these ideas and discuss their merits and otherwise. So he said what they found themselves dealing with was 2 things. One was the illness, and the other was the sickness. The illness, he said, was actually relatively simple. You decided on your treatments, you dealt with the various aspects of what you needed to do. The sickness was all about the culture. how people saw it, how you yourself saw it, all of these different beliefs around illness. And they were constantly trying to deal with that. They were constantly trying to sort out the difference between these two threads and deal with them. So he said the first problem, which is with cancer as illness, was getting information. And as he says here, with cancer, none of it is true. So they went looking for information, discovered there was actually no truth. Most things don't work, and the doctor knows it. He can't cure the illness, yet he has to do something to change the way the patient thinks about it, the meaning, the sickness. And this keeps the patient, as one doctor said, oriented toward the proper medical authorities instead of running off into some alternative thing, so they prescribe radiation and chemo, and many times they cite one situation where the person says, well, how long would I live if I had the chemo? And they say 12 months. And apparently then this person thought to ask, well, how long would I live without the chemo? And they said 14 months. So, I mean, it's just mind-boggling that this can go on. However, alternative is no better. So, as he points out, and where most medical scientific information is either inconclusive or honestly negative, most alternative information is anecdotal and unrelentingly positive. Reading alternative literature, you begin to get the giddy feeling that everybody treated by orthodox medicine dies, and everybody treated by alternative medicine lives, except those who were first treated by orthodox methods. They all die. The alternatives are mostly in the business of treating the sickness of cancer, of providing positive meaning, moral support, and above all, hope to those stricken with illness. It goes on, this is what we were always faced with, separating the illness of cancer from the sickness of cancer, and trying to learn the best way to treat the illness and the sanest way to understand the illness. As he says, when illness is viewed positively and in supportive terms, then illness has a much better chance to heal, with the concomitant result that the entire person may grow and be enriched in the process. So he's not throwing out alternative. He sees the value of both, but he also sees the errors in thinking in both. So his guess that he throws into the book is that most illness is 30% genetic, 55% environmental, which includes diet, sunlight, pollution in the environment, and 15% everything else, which is the emotional and spiritual. So thus, he says, it's basically 85% physical. Not a very new age notion. So now, as a result of this, Treya goes into a radical reassessment of her life. What can she do? She can work on herself. She can look at her beliefs. She can look into natural healing. She can do all of these various things. And one of the central issues in the book that she talks about is the concept of daemon. And the idea of your daemon is that guiding star that leads you to what you are supposed to do in life, your mission. And she's always struggled all her life with not having it. She's felt like she should have a meaning and a purpose. And in fact, she's done many things. She spent 3 years at Findhorn working there. She's, I can't remember all the other things in the book, but she's had a very active, busy, involved, contributive life. But she still feels like she hasn't found her thing. Ken has found his thing. He said the first time he wrote, I think it was Spectrum of Consciousness, he knew that was it. That was his thing, writing. But now he can't do it. So she's struggling to find her daemon. He has it, but he can't do it. Although he is writing Transformations of Consciousness and does finish that. So now in here, Treya gets pregnant. She didn't actually think she could, but she does. She's now 36, 37. And he, when she mentions it, is very ambivalent. He isn't sure he wants a family. This upsets her, so that sets up some tension between them. But she has to abort because the hormones will cause her basically to die if she doesn't. So she has to abort the child, very distressing for her, and also distressing that he doesn't share the same kind of attitude with her. But after a time with this, he comes around and he starts thinking, a family would be nice sometimes. So when Treya gets well, so they decide to move to Lake Tahoe and get a house and fix it up and start a family. So they go to a place called Incline Village, which is one of the small towns around, and they start doing some construction on a house there. So they also found now, in terms of their spirituality, that her death, her potential death looming over them all the time, really focused their spirituality. So he spends some time in this book talking about his sense of it. He is, at that time, very much allied with the perennial philosophy. He does drift from that later, but here he is. And he says that there are important correlations across cultures, and these are: spirit exists, spirit is found within, we live in an illusory world, there is a path to liberation, to enlightenment, there is a direct experience of spirit within, and then when you have this, it comes forth into acts of mercy and compassion on behalf of the rest of the world. And he says that all of the major religions in some way have this kind of a path. She is a Buddhist practitioner. She had a mystical experience at 13, which kind of catapulted her into that. And she goes, during this period, she goes on a 10-day silent retreat herself, and there's a really, really beautiful section, page 93, where she talks about her meditation experiences. So the cancer recurs. A year after the first surgery, she ends up having a mastectomy because the cancer is back. And she goes on, she's engaged, and all through the book, she is engaged in an amazing series of practices. So diet, mega vitamins, meditation, visualization and affirmations, journal keeping, exercise. She is absolutely taken up with all of these, and she practices them the whole way through. So she has a mastectomy, she's doing these things, and then she gets a recurrence in the chest wall, which is not a very good sign at all. So they recommend aggressive chemotherapy, which will put her heart at risk, her ovaries at risk, her hair, and has poor odds, and she has poor odds of survival. So now, despite everything they've been doing, despite all of their efforts to feel like they can finally get back to a normal life, here they go again. So there's a description of when she goes in for this chemotherapy, and her first reaction to one of the items was a severe reaction. One of the drugs causes very high histamine levels in the body, which can cause panic attacks and various other things like that, which happened to her. But at the same time, the humor was always present. She lost her hair. So Ken says to her, she says, "We look like the melon section in a supermarket." And then he said, "Promise me one thing, we'll never go bowling." So, I mean, that's woven into the book all the way through, this sense of humor, the capacity they have to laugh at it. He calls it one time things, the fun with cancer, all this stuff you get to do with cancer. So, and she, I mean, it's not at her expense, she's very much involved in the humor. Now, this is the time when Ken also gets sick. So could things get any worse? He says in 1985, a bizarre disease blew into this village, infecting over 200 people with a debilitating illness. I was one of the lucky 200. Muscle spasms, almost convulsion degree tremors, chronic fever, swollen glands, horrible night sweats, above all debilitating exhaustion. I would get out of bed, brush my teeth, and consider it a day's work. So my son has this illness, and I'm very well acquainted with it, and it's just absolutely terribly destructive. So he becomes suicidal. She is suicidal and has anxiety attacks. He is not writing, he's not meditating, he's lost his connection to the witness. So he had a very stabilized connection to the witness, and now it's gone. And so his reaction was to blame Treya. If I weren't doing all of this for you, I would be able to meditate, I would be able to write, and all that sort of thing. She was experiencing premature menopause and mood swings, so you can imagine what their life was like between the two of them. So a great wear and tear on the relationship. And he jokes, they look up there's this little chart with the level of points you get for stress, so divorce has X number of thing, death has X number of points. He said we have so many stress points already that if we take a vacation, which also has stress points, it'll kill us. So he's drinking now. He's drinking a lot. And he said this led to a downward spiral of guilt and blame that led Treya to despair and me to Andy's Sporting Goods. And this Andy's Sporting Goods is where they sell guns. So he was sitting around thinking about killing himself. And she writes in her journal, he seems tired of living, he's lost his desire to write. And he writes that he was bitter, resentful, sarcastic, and she was defensive, obsessive, and demanding. So there we are. You know, that's one of the terrible things about tragedy of any kind. It seems to bring with it more and more and more tragedy. I remember reading once that in a family where a child dies, the likelihood of divorce goes up to something like 60% or 70%, very high. And so it just seems one tragedy gets piled on another. So they leave Incline Village, they go back to San Francisco, they go back to their friends, and they go back to a therapist that they have there. And he's extremely helpful. They also work at this time with the Course in Miracles. And the Course in Miracles is, probably many of you know about it, it's a channeled work written in the voice of Christ. And it's all about forgiveness. He says the ego never forgets. It never forgives and never forgets. But with forgiveness, boundaries are dissolved and you can have a return to the witness. So the Course in Miracles is another approach to developing this witness self, but in a very sort of heartfelt, wonderful way. So he said it took a year before they could stabilize their relationship again. During that time, he makes the remark that he's a pandit and not a guru. You may see there's a interview series called The Pandit and the Guru. It's him with Andrew Cohen and various things. But he sees himself as a scholar. He does not want to be a guru. He doesn't see himself in that way. She writes in her journal, and the passages in her journal in this book are absolutely beautiful. She's a wonderful writer. She's a very, very honest, deep person. And so reading them is just amazing. You feel like you really come into who she is. And she talks about, you know, bringing up her faults. She's been working on herself all this time, trying to find, you know, if there's a psychological cause of illness, what is it that I'm doing? And she talks about this practice, which is actually something that I've come to, of when you see, you know, some horrendous part of yourself, and you just let it come up, and you just keep observing it. Eventually, it ceases to have the triggers that it has before, and it fades. I mean, you never lose it entirely, I don't think. But anyway, you hold it differently. And then he writes about her. He writes about her courage, her resiliency, her honesty, and his love for her. And all through the book, he keeps talking about her integrity, that he had never met anybody with such integrity and so much honesty. And that comes through in her writing. So now into healing. And this is a phrase that I've used in my course because I think it's really, really important. We were realizing that healing occurs and must occur on all levels of being: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. And we were just beginning to realize that physical healing, although desirous, is often the least important or least indicative of genuine health, which is the health of the soul, the recovery of the soul. So this really grounds them. This just offers them a way to be with this illness because they really delve into the emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects and grow both of them. He also comments that you need to heal at the proper level. If you diagnose a disease at a higher level than it actually is, it induces guilt. So for example, if an illness is, if you diagnosed a broken leg as something that was psychological in origin, everybody's going to feel guilty because they can't heal a broken leg with a psychological change. But if you diagnose something at a lower level than what it is, let's say you diagnose it as an emotional problem when it's actually a spiritual problem, then you will also come to a hard situation of despair. Because again, you need to match them up. So this goes along with the book he's writing, Transformations of Consciousness. This is obviously in his mind as he's going. And he says, always start at the bottom with the physical. Try to fix the physical first. and then move up. So now he goes again into a long discussion of philosophy and spirituality, and he talks a lot about the difference between esoteric and exoteric spirituality. So if you're interested in that, I'm not going to go. This book is so chock-a-block, I can't go into everything. His basic point is that that esoteric spirituality, which is the going within and this sort of thing, as exoteric is religion, basically. It's all of the forms that have formed around this. That if you don't perform the experiment, you can't vote. So he says it's like science. You want to understand something about microscopic creatures, you have to learn to use a microscope, and you have to learn what they look like and how they move, and then you can vote on what this thing is. And the same thing with spirituality. You have to develop this meditative capacity, and then you will start to see what's happening, and you can talk about it. And you're one of somebody else called, I think Terry Patton calls it the community of the adequate. And you can't go around making pronouncements about it unless you've actually done the work to get into that community. So here he criticizes two people, one of them Joseph Campbell. And he says Joseph Campbell tends to take a metaphysical view on a lot of myths. So all of these myths that he writes about, and then he says what they were really meaning was, and he takes it into a higher level of understanding. And Ken says, no, these were mythic beliefs. These people were talking about mythic beliefs. The other beliefs that he's writing about are great, but they were not necessarily the mythic beliefs. So he disagrees with Joseph Campbell's entire way of looking at things. And so, he's stepping right into a hornet's nest here, because at this time Joseph Campbell is extremely popular. He also criticizes Jung, and another hornet's nest to step into. And he says that Jung made a mistake in confusing the collective unconscious with the transpersonal and mystical. Because I don't know how much everybody knows about Jung, but Jung talks a lot about archetypes, like the warrior or the mother or the trickster and all these kinds of things. And he says these are in the collective unconscious, and he kind of equates these to the transpersonal. But Ken says archetypes in the mystical are not the same thing as the mythic structures that Jung used. And I think this goes back to our discussion that we had about what is causal and what is witness and all of that kind of thing. So these archetypes that Jung is talking about, the great mother and the trickster, and they are existential, not transcendental. So for mystics, the archetypes are the first subtle forms of manifestation. First there is nothing, and then comes into being, most of them, he said, radiant patterns on points of light, audible illuminations, vibrations, things like that. They're not things. They're not something that we would look at and say that's a thing. So he takes issue with Jung here. So the book is filled with all these fascinating side roads and different ways of looking at spirituality and things like that. He also points out the difference between the infant oceanic consciousness, which he says is a fusion with only the physical or sensory motor level, and mystical union, which is a union with all levels of existence, physical, biological, mental, and spiritual. So this comes out in all of his theory as he goes along with the stages of development, that we start and we gradually develop this individual self, this rational self, and then we gradually transcend that self. But there was a lot of going on where people were saying that the infant, we wanted to go back to this oceanic consciousness, and that was the place to be, and primitive cultures had it, and blah, blah, blah. And he's saying, no. That's the lowest level of fusion, and you need to move through the stages before you can really call yourself enlightened, I suppose. So this is the pre-trans fallacy. This is where people look at what is pre-rational, something before a person develops a rational mind, like a child. Before they get a rational mind, they have a pre-rational consciousness. But after they have a rational mind and they continue to transcend that rational mind, now they've got a post-rational consciousness. And he says so many people, particularly the green level of development, mix these up, and they think they are the same thing. The orange level mixes them up. They think they're all down here. Green thinks they're all up here. And he says, no, there are two different things, and we have to separate these. And he says what Jung does is he elevates this pre-egoic state, this non-rational state, into the transcendental. And he says that Freud, however, reduces this trans-rational state down to the pre-egoic. For Freud, everything is about the physical self and sex and all that kind of stuff. And he sees that as transcendental. So he makes the point in this that meditation does not eliminate psychoneuroses. So people think, if I just sit there and I witness everything that's going on with me, I will be wonderful and enlightened and everything. He said, I can tell you from rather bitter personal experience that Zen has done much to let me live with my neuroses and not much at all for getting rid of them. So that's where we come up with the enlightened jerk. The person has done no work on themselves, but they get an enlightenment experience, and so they tend to think, I am God, me. This little me is God, not the larger me. So he makes this point, and this is a very strong point he continues to make all through his career, that we have to separate, we have to work on the shadow. That just meditating and just going, into this spiritual bypass, as it's called now, is not an answer. We have to also work on our personal selves. So now, back to the illness, she now develops diabetes. This had been in her family, but the chemotherapy apparently has triggered it. And diabetes is a very serious illness. He points out it's the number 3 killer. It requires her to have injections, change her diet radically, constantly check her blood sugar, leads to dehydration, mood swings, the collapse of small capillaries, which is why people end up getting amputations because the blood supply does not go through. And at this time also, they had thought that she has a catheter constantly giving her chemo during this time, and they had come to the time when it normally would come out. And the doctor tells her he doesn't want to take it out because he's still afraid of a recurrence. So now this is another low for them, another real low. But he says she was amazing. She became more open, more loving, more forgiving, and more compassionate. So you can see Treya's growth through all of this is just astounding to see how she dealt, and she's very human too. She's not like some airy-fairy person on the sky. She's dealing with a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, a lot of all of this sort of stuff, but she really does take it in. And she finds her daemon, and she comes to understand that for her, it's not so much the act of producing something as it is it's more diffuse, it's more amorphous, it's creating environments in which things can happen. It's doing her art, it is just being. She says being is okay. So she has moved, when she was growing up, her father was a very powerful influence in her life. And she said, I always was trying to be the elder son. And she was pushing herself and driving and doing, always doing. And so now she moves into her more feminine side. And she begins to find herself there, that's more her. So she's moving away from the masculine values that have driven her. And she calls herself not the knower or the doer, but the maker. And she uses the phrase, a woman who works with her hands. And that's how she starts to see herself. So she starts working on pottery, stained glass, needlepoint, and also her writing. She's working on a book. Her stained glass was apparently stunningly beautiful. And there's, and people were just astounded by it. There's some, I don't know, you can see it at all. You can come and look at the book afterwards, but some of these are some of her designs. And it was apparently, for somebody who had really no experience, was just astounding. So she takes that up, and she's happy. She's working on all of these things that she loves. And she also starts something called the Cancer Support Community with a woman named Vicki Wells, who was also a cancer survivor. And they move themselves away from another group they have been working on. And this other group is all about healing cancer. And they say ours felt like a more feminine approach with less emphasis on fighting cancer or on recovering from cancer and more emphasis on overall quality of life during the whole process. We didn't want to set it up so people felt they failed or lost somehow if the cancer remained. People who were cancer patients, they wanted to work with people who were cancer patients and not the other way around, and help people just to be with cancer even while you're trying to do something about it. And it was really interesting for me to read this because the approach I take in my courses about illness is basically this, helping people to live a more full life with illness rather than a healing approach. And I had forgotten, I read this in 96 or something like that, I don't remember. And this was, I read and I thought, well, maybe that stayed in my mind. Maybe that's why I did this, or maybe I just came to it on my own, I'm not sure. So now he takes on the New Age and their views of illness, because they have been seriously battered by many people approaching them with these views. But many people had come with, you should try this, you should try that, you're not spiritual enough, if you were more spiritual, you wouldn't have this illness, if you blah, 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 endlessly. People felt that they had the right to comment on other people's, on their particular situation. And she actually writes an article about this, which I'll mention later, about what really helps. And it's, having a lot of respect for the other person's, for the sick person's perspective and what they're doing. So he criticizes the New Age notion that people bring on their illness either by their own thoughts or as some sort of mega lesson they need to learn, as opposed to simply learning from illness, whatever its cause, which is what they do. They take illness as an opportunity to learn. He says she was simply assaulted by well-meaning people who were going to help her see why she gave herself diabetes. He calls these lopsided, all of these ideas that were presented were lopsided, partial, and dangerous. Treya called them too masculine, too controlling, too aggressive, and too violating. And there's one episode where a woman calls on a phone and because Treya's going to go to this healing conference of some sort or another, and the woman says, oh, well, we're glad to have you come, and I hope you'll be very honest and open. And she says, yes, and the woman says something about, and that you won't be upset when people tell you why it is that you're getting this cancer. And Ken apparently was listening on the other line, and he just swore up and down that he said, the only thing that's wrong with Tyra is you blackety blank people, and hung up the phone. And apparently she tried to smooth things over later, but she said it was a little difficult because of what he had just said. So he's furious about this, just furious. And then they go to Boston to visit some people, and she goes to a sermon, and she hears this wonderful quote. Can we not give up that ancient superstition that those who suffer deserve their suffering? It's just part of the human condition. And I think that's so important. Everybody gets sick and dies. Everybody has this. People who are neurotic get illnesses. People who are not neurotic get the same illnesses. There's people trying to, if it's your left knee, it's this and that. Everybody's different, and it's just part of the human condition. So there's a comment also that I want to read from Ramana Maharshi here, which they also take to heart and see as really important. Ramana maintained that only in befriending our suffering, our illness, our pain, could we truly find a larger and more encompassing identity with all, with the self, who is not the victim of life, but its impartial witness and source. And especially, Ramana said, befriend death, the ultimate teacher. And she started to become kind of a national spokesperson for a more compassionate view of illness. She wrote an article called What Kind of Help Really Helps, and it's in its entirety in here on page 253. And Oprah called her and wanted her to be on the show across from Bernie Siegel, and she declined. She said, no, she's just going to want me to argue with Bernie. So I'm not going, which I thought was actually, a lot of personal integrity and strength to do that. So now we come to June 2nd, 1986. They're going to finally take the catheter out. But on the 16th, she discovered a lump on her chest under her arm. It's removed. It was cancer, and it was radiation resistant. So they knew what this meant. The possibility of a really gruesome metastasis to bone, brain, or lung would be very high. But he said Treya's reaction was in equanimity. She seemed to be at peace with this. She seemed to be able to live with this. Not that she wanted it, not that she didn't cry. She cried a lot. But she seemed to be able to hold this and to move through it. He says she had come from doing to being, from knowing to making, from obsessive to trusting, from masculine to feminine, and most of all, from controlling to accepting. So she had done all this work on herself as a result of this illness. So it makes you see that they really did find the value in working with illness. They didn't avoid that at all. And she has at this time a dream, or she talks about a dream that she had in which she was supposed to call herself Treya. In fact, it was going to be Estrella, which is a Spanish word for star. And so she takes the idea of Treya, that she wants this more feminine. She was called Terry. Her name was Terry before, and she wants to change it to something more feminine. She's also now excited to pursue more alternatives. So this is where she said she'd pushed herself to being the eldest son. And she said she was now seeing the idea of do-it-yourself as a carcinogenic concept, that actually might lead to this hyper do-it-yourself kind of thing. Ken said he had the opposite problem. He thought everybody should love him, but if they didn't, he got nervous and he overcompensated. So he became class president and valedictorian and captain of the football team and a frantic dance for acceptance. So they're both unearthing their personal, stories here and what they need to do with them. So he was also he was blocked. He was unable to write at this time. And he looked at this, he said, the anxiety can be aggression you don't want to have surface. In other words, you're really angry, but you won't let it out, so it leaves you anxious. Or it's a daemon, this thing you're supposed to be doing that wants to come forth and you won't let it happen, and you blame it on others instead of taking responsibility for yourself, which is what he did. So now they decide to go visit energy healers and do a lot of other possibilities. And they go to see this energy healer, and it's a wonderful little segment. This woman is a piece of work, and Ken actually really likes her, but he doesn't think she's making any sense at all. So he said, yes, energy works, but the healers don't know what they're doing, so they make up stories about it. So this woman was going on and on about, I had 7 forms of cancer and I did this and I've done that. And, he said he didn't believe a word of it. And she had healed all these famous people and they had had this and they had had that. And but Treya doesn't like it that Ken laughs at this because she wants him behind her 100%. She says, it's really important to me that I go in with a lot of faith on this. So then this woman works on Ken, and she says, oh my God, she says, you have 10 channels on one side, that's the ultimate, and 7 on the other. I've never seen anybody except for her, because she had all of her channels open, other than like the Buddha. There are nobody like that. So she works on him, and she says, okay, now they're all open. And so, once again, he felt the energy. He felt the energy work, but he didn't believe the story. So now we come to November 16th, it's Treya's 40th birthday, and this is where she lets people know she's changed her name to Treya. She had some trepidation because it seemed like a really new age thing, these people who give themselves these fancy names. She didn't like that, but she thought it was really important somehow. They also found a teacher that satisfied them both, and as Carol points out, she had been very involved in Vipassana and he'd been very involved in Zen. But they found a teacher that they both liked. And he talks about some of the changes in them. 243. So she writes, this is part of her journal. I think I like to give some of the feel of her. Other ways I've changed beside my name. I'm doing something I really love to do, fused glass artwork. Something I can't wait to get back to, something I dream about. Something totally new that doesn't come from my past, from anything anybody encouraged me to do. a real break with the past, and yet something I've always been intrigued by, interested in, something that was somehow innately there inside me all along, only I never saw it through the filters I was wearing then. I'm less critical of others. I don't hold them to the standards of conventional or doing success. I have a good friend who is a weaver. Her husband is a political activist. I no longer think her work is unimportant compared to his. I'm not only more tolerant of, but genuinely interested in the various ways people choose to shape their lives. And a quick judgment isn't waiting in the wings, ready to pop on stage at any time. I see all of life as more of a game, not quite so totally loaded with importance. It's more fun, easier. I hold life more lightly. My own school-marmish attitude, the tendency to proofread others' lives, is lessening. I don't have to have it my way so much, control so much, and I assume less and less that there is a correct or accurate grammar for people's lives. I am therefore less quick to anger, to react. I try to simply witness, without judgment, myself and others. I trust myself more. I'm kinder to myself. I believe there is a wisdom guiding my life, and that my life doesn't have to look like anyone else's to feel good and fulfilling, and yes, even successful. So now they moved to Boulder. They went to Boulder, they both really liked it there, and so they moved. It's been 9 months since she had the recurrence, but she's having these strange, menacing dreams, so they're a little edgy about that. He starts writing again, and he wants to have a child now. She's doing her glasswork and this work with this cancer survivor community, and life between them is good again. So I think it's amazing, too, that they could heal a relationship that had gotten to the place where there's one place in the book where he hits her and screams, and they're having horrible relationship, horrible. So here they are. They have recovered from this. And anybody who's been in a relationship knows that when things start to go bad, it's really, really hard to bring them back. So in the midst of all this, they are able to do that. So he goes back again to talking about New Age views and his dislike of them. And he makes a point here that all levels, body, mind, soul, and spirit, influence each other. But there's a confusion between the psychosomatic and the psychogenic. And I really like this. The psychosomatic is that the body and the mind interact. Something in the mind can cause something in the body. Like, you just think, you get scared and adrenaline runs through your body. But I know something in the body can also cause something in the mind. So you're sick for years, and you get depressed. Psychogenic means it's caused by the mind. The illness is the mind. He said you have to distinguish between these two, and the New Age doesn't do that. He also takes on the idea of karma, and there's a long discussion about this, but basically he said there are two Buddhist looks at karma. One of them is that what happened in your last life is causing what's happening now. They're very simplistic. You're reading the book of your past life. Or there's a quote here. What am I doing for time? 2:65. So he says, as Namkhai Norbu, master of Dzogchen Buddhism, generally regarded as the pinnacle of Buddhist teaching, explains, there are illnesses produced due to karma, or the previous conditions of the individual, but there are also illnesses generated by energies that come from others, from the outside. And there are illnesses that are provoked by provisional causes, such as food or other combinations of circumstances. And there are illnesses generated by accident. Then there are all kinds of illnesses linked with the environment. So Ken makes the point that neither the primitive version of karma nor the more evolved teachings lend any support to the New Age notion. So he goes into this idea again of create your own reality, which he does not go along with. He says you create your experience of reality, but you don't create your own reality. And then he points out the difference. He says people have a tendency to think it's either rational or post-rational. So either you create your own reality, which is a post-rational view, or you don't, which is the rational view. But he said there's also the pre-rational, which makes errors in thinking that like my mind can directly affect this table without a step in between, which is my mind decides it wants to change the shape of the table, and it then does go and change the shape of the table. So he gets pretty hot under the collar about all this. And I have to say, my experience has been I agree with him. So I've had my own problems with the New Age attitude, so I like this. And not everybody's going to agree. And actually, I've been more open recently to some other ways of looking at it. But okay, so here's the discussion of their practices that you brought up. That she was doing Vipassana, and he was doing a number of different practices, but all of them within a very strict development of Buddhism. And he talks about the progression of practices in Buddhism. And he talks about Hinayana Buddhism, which is the Vipassana practice that she was using, which is insight meditation. You do it by sitting, and you notice various parts of your body, and you continue to focus in, so you're constantly noticing, constantly aware. But he said to her at the time that wasn't enough. She needed more than that. I mean, that was a good practice, and it's a good beginning practice, but it's not enough. Then Mahayana Buddhism, which deals with compassion practices, which are supposed to undercut this egoic self-concern and our dualism. So it's to take us away from our total focus on our separate self-sense. And Tonglen is one of these practices. And then the final one is Vajrayana, which is where there's only one spirit. So they focused on Tonglen and a deity meditation, which was in the next level. So there's a quote here on Tonglen, which I think explains it. If not, I will. If you don't. 51. Yeah, with Tonglen, you don't distance yourself from suffering, yours or others. You relate to it in a simple and direct and compassionate way. You don't stand back from it and weave pet theories about what caused it, or why the person brought it on themselves, or what it really means. That is not a helpful way to relate to a person's suffering. That is a way to distance yourself from them. No matter how helpful you might think your theorizing is, it is ultimately just a way to say, don't touch me. The way that Tonglen works, probably you all know it, but basically you for instance, could focus on another person and their suffering, and you take that suffering into yourself, either black tar or whatever, you just take it all in. And then you breathe out compassion and light. And you can do this at an individual level, or you can do it, as you said, you can then take the person's town, and you breathe in all of the suffering in that town, and then you breathe out compassion and light and healing to them. And then you can take it to the whole globe. So that is the practice of Tonglen. And people always say, but oh my God, what if I take all that in and I get sick? And the teacher said, yeah, well, good, then you're doing it right. But as Ken says, I've never known anybody get sick from doing this practice. But what it does is it really, really allows you to empathize with another person's suffering, and to realize that you are no different from them, and that it, anyway, so very important. And then he does a discussion of Dzogchen, which is basically says you don't even have to meditate. This is the direct practice. You realize the awareness that is already there, and you just keep doing that. If you read Nisargadatta Maharaj, he just focuses on this witness self. Just keep focusing on that. Keep focusing on that. That's all you need to do, and then you will become illumined. Oh, okay. So now, her 1-year test is clear. But a few months later, she has visual issues. They go in, and a CAT scan shows brain tumors and lung tumors. Her life expectancy at this point is a year. So there's a quote about her state of mind. 283. I had several days at first when I felt incredibly shaky, crying a lot, very agitated, close to falling apart. dwelling on fears of pain and thoughts of death. And then would come thoughts of all who are suffering on this planet at this moment, of all who have suffered in the past. And I would immediately feel a wave of peace and calm pass through me. I no longer felt alone. I no longer felt singled out. Instead, I felt an incredible connection with all these people, like we were part of the same huge family. I thought of all the children who have cancer. I thought of the people who die unexpectedly at young ages in traffic accidents. I thought of those who suffer from mental illness. I thought of the starving in the third world, of children who will always be handicapped by malnutrition even if they survive. I thought of parents who must endure the death of a child, of all those who died in Vietnam when they were only half my age, of those who are victims of torture. My heart went out to them all as members of my family, and I felt comforted by remembering the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. There is suffering in this world. No way around that one, always has been. And she starts to be drawn again to Christianity. She continues her Buddhist practices, but she also begins to find beauty in the Christian practices. Not the Christian theology, but the Christian practices. So now she has to choose something pretty drastic to see if she can get rid of this. And there's a place called the Janker Clinic in Bonn, which offers a very, very high dose of chemotherapy, 3 separate treatments once a month. And the doctors in the US say, oh, don't do this, don't do this. But she gets there, and she discovers actually a lot easier than the chemo that she had been on in this country. Reading that, I thought, well, but she gets a chest cold. And this thing is so fast growing that the thought of waiting, and it takes 2 or 3 weeks for her to get over this chest cold, and they start the radiation, but they won't start the chemo. But she does go ahead with it finally. So while they're over there, her parents come over, they take a trip to Paris together between the first and the second treatments. There's a beautiful writing in her journal. She's just such a beautiful writer able to capture these places and things. And she gets a 5-pointed star necklace, I think, from her parents. And this goes back to her vision, this Estrella, the star. And she ends up coming back to the hospital and loses this necklace. Well, it's become really important to her. It's been kind of a talisman. She's devastated at the loss of this necklace. And then she starts a practice in which she mentally gives this necklace away to everybody. When she sees a person suffering, she gives them her necklace, and she continues to do this practice over and over again. And then they discover about 3 weeks later that Ken had it stuck in a pocket of his jeans. And he brings it back to her, so she has her necklace. But just that practice of even something that she treasured so much, just to give it away. So then they, between treatments 2 and 3, they come back to Boulder. He makes the comment that he is at home in ideas and she is at home in nature, and their differences, and then about their coming together. And this captures a little of where they are in their relationship. Okay. I took feelings and related them to ideas. Treya took ideas and related them to feelings. I moved from the particular to the universal, constantly. Treya moved from the universal to the concrete, always. I loved thinking. She loved making. I loved culture. She loved nature. I shut the window so I could hear Bach. She turned off Bach so she could hear the birds. In the tradition, spirit is found neither in heaven nor in earth, but in the heart. The heart has always been seen as the integration or the union point of heaven and earth, the point that earth grounded heaven and heaven exalted the earth. Neither heaven nor earth alone could capture spirit. Only the balance of the two found in the heart could lead to the secret door beyond death and mortality and pain. And that is what Treya had done for me. That is what we had done for each other, pointed the way to the heart. When we put our arms around each other, heaven and earth united. Bach and the birds both started singing. Happiness opened up before us as far as the eye could see. When we were first together, we were sometimes irritated by these differences. Me, the absent-minded professor, always taking flight in ideas, spinning complex theories around the simplest of events. Treya always hugging the ground, refusing to fly without planning the schedules ahead of time. But soon we came to see that was the entire point, that we were indifferent, that we were different, and that far from being whole and self-contained people, we were each half people, one of heaven, one of earth, and that was exactly as it should be. Treya, I would always be at home in ideas. Treya will always be at home in nature, but together, joined in the heart, we were whole. Okay. So all through this, Ken is doing everything. He's cooking, he's cleaning, he's doing all the errands, he's monitoring her medications, he's making the appointments. He's a complete caregiver. He is totally the support person. And he writes a letter on caregiving for people who are caregivers. And one of the things he makes the point of is he said, your real role is not what you do, it's to be an emotional sponge. It's to take in all of those emotions from the other person. And it's not about doing, it's about making the choice. And he said he came to a place, there was a time when, when they were doing, but he was resenting this and everything like that. He said, now every day I make a choice. I'm here because of a choice. He also, he does, there's a little video of him as well in the bio project where he talks about, okay, so you're the caregiver. He said, well, all right, everything that's wrong with you doesn't count because you don't have cancer. He said, this person always has the trump card. They have cancer. So whatever's going wrong in your life, and all of these horrible things can happen, there is no way to talk about them. And he talks about how after she died, he would find every day, he would come to this place and he would just sob for half an hour. And he said, I was reliving all of those horrible incidents that I had no opportunity. He was trying to be strong for her and take in her emotions instead of his own. And that he realized, and he makes, recommendations of get a support group and be with other people because, there's no help for you, basically. And then he talks about the concept of service, and they both come to this. He talks about how he sees that as the only point in life, really, to come to a place where you serve. And she says about that. So she's, they go to some church in Cologne, I guess. At this moment in church, kneeling before the masses of candles flickering in the soft gloom, the only thing I could think of that gives life meaning is helping other people. Service, in a word. Things like spiritual growth or enlightenment seemed like nothing more than concepts. Full development of one's potential also seemed trite and egocentric, unless it leads, as it often does, to ideas or creations that help relieve suffering. What about beauty, my artwork, creativity? Well, for today, at least, it didn't seem very important, except perhaps for the art that adorns sacred places like this cathedral. Human relationship, human connections, indeed, gentle, loving relationship with all forms of life and all of creation, only that seemed important. Keeping my heart open, always my biggest challenge, letting down the defenses, being open to pain so joy can also enter. And these were not written in her mind with any thought of publication. It wasn't until she was nearly dying. He said he was actually going to destroy her journals because they were her and they were totally private to her. And just before she died, she said, you're going to need these. So he did take so none of this is all just her internal, or not written for publication. So now they go back to Bonn for the third treatment, and they discover the tumor markers have increased. The treatment, radiation and chemo, has not worked. 20% of the brain tumor is still there, and the doctor is really disappointed because he was sure that was going to go. And the lung tumors were not even touched. So now she has 40 lung tumors, 3 brain tumors, at least 2 liver tumors, and possible lymph involvement. So they leap on and they go to this other treatment place, and this is a person who offers this digestive enzymes, and they feed them, and they're supposed to digest the tumors. And she likes this program. She likes and the evidence seems to be good. A lot of people have done very well with this, and she continues all of her other practices. So at this point, he says, to conventional doctors, she had 2 to 4 months to live. to Gonzalez, the guy with the enzyme treatment, she now had a 70% chance of making it. So as they keep doing tests on these tumors, the tumors grow. So to the conventional doctors, you know, she's at the verge of death. To Gonzalez, it shows that what's happening is the tissues are dying and expanding as they do that, and they're being absorbed by the body. And so it became a race to see if they could get absorbed fast enough for, like, the brain, you know, the pressure on her brain was great. And he said he was split between believing both of them, the conventional doctors and the alternative. But Treya felt full of joy. They go to John Denver's wedding. They go to a WinStar. She worked at WinStar for a long time, and she's asked to give a speech, which is in there, and which I'm going to play. And her phrase at that time was passionate equanimity. That was how she lived. So here's this 5-minute clip. You want to? I thought it would be good to just see her actually speaking herself, so we can see her giving this talk.
Hello, my name is Treya Wilber. A lot of you have known me in the past as Terry. I've been involved with WinStar from the early days. 5 years ago this same month, in August of '83, I met and totally fell in love with Ken Wilber. I always called it love at first touch. We were married less than 4 months later, but 10 days after our wedding, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. We spent our honeymoon in the hospital. I've had 2 local recurrences and a number of treatments, both conventional and alternative, in the intervening years. But just this January, we discovered that the cancer had metastasized, that it had spread to my brain and to my lungs. The doctors we've consulted have said I have 2 to 4 years to live. So when Tommy asked me to speak tonight, my first thought was, but I'm still sick. You know, the other people who are going to speak have in some way overcome the challenges in their life or have crafted something of use from the difficulties. You'll hear from Mitchell, an old friend of mine, later this evening. Well, I thought, okay, I'm still sick. Maybe I can look at what I've done with my life since the diagnosis. I've counseled hundreds of people over the phone and in person. I co-founded a place in San Francisco called the Cancer Support Community, which now provides a wide range of free services for hundreds of people each week. I've written as honestly as I can about my experiences in a way that many say they have found helpful and hope to publish a book soon. But when I got to the end of this list of doing, I thought, oh, I've fallen into an old familiar trap. I'm equating success with physical healing against all odds or with concrete accomplishments in the world. I feel instead that the shift in perspective that we're here to celebrate tonight is an inner change, an inner choice. I find that for me, this takes the form of the spiritual work that I do each day. And I'm very eclectic. I draw at all traditions. I'll read anybody. But if I don't do this, if I don't take the time to do this, I find that my situation very quickly becomes frightening or depressing or sometimes even boring. While if I maintain this work each day, I find myself continually engaged by life, continually excited and challenged by this incredible situation that I'm in. If I maintain this work, the emotional roller coaster of advanced cancer becomes for me a chance to practice both equanimity in a true sense, at the same time that I find my passion for life increasing. Learning to make friends with cancer, learning to make friends with the possibility of an early and perhaps painful death, has taught me a great deal about making friends with myself as I am, and a great deal about making friends with life as it is. I know there are a lot of things I can't change. I can't force life to make sense or to be fair. This growing acceptance of life as it is, with all the sorrow, the pain, the suffering, and the tragedy, has brought me a kind of peace. I find that I feel ever more connected with all beings who suffer in a really genuine way, And I find a more open sense of compassion. And I find an ever steadier desire to help in whatever way I can. There's an old saying, it's popular among people with cancer, that goes, life is terminal. In a way, I'm lucky, because I've been given advance warning, and I've been given time to take advantage of that advance warning. I always notice how old people are when they die. I always notice newspaper articles about young people who die in accidents. In fact, I used to cut these articles out. Because I could no longer ignore death, I pay more attention to life.
So, I want to read about the condition that she is now in. Okay, so she's writing a letter to a friend, and in the letter she says, "As for Ken, he does almost everything for me now, me in my little old lady mode. He's there for me in every way. He'll be embarrassed by this, but I keep calling him my champion. He cooks for me, he watches over me, he takes care of my diet, he gets me to the doctors, he helps me with my insulin, he even helps bathe me when I'm tired. He gets up at 5 each morning so he can meditate before he devotes the rest of the day to helping me. Something really wonderful is happening in his meditation. When he said to me that he had learned how to serve, his actions are proving it royally. When I tell him how sorry I am that cancer has ruined his career, he looks at me with his big browns and says, 'I'm the luckiest guy in the world. What a sweetie. How's the rest of my body doing?' And he says, Treya didn't have a chance to finish the letter because she had gone blind in her left eye. Right about the time that she went on oxygen, I began noticing that she didn't respond well to things in her left visual field. Tests confirmed it. The tumors in her brain were affecting the optic center, and Treya had probably permanently lost all vision in her left eye. Whether the damage was due to growing tumor or dying tumor, we couldn't tell. Of course, the orthodox said growing. Gonzalez said dying. But for the moment, that wasn't the point. Either way, the brain, not the lungs, had become our immediate concern. Either way, the mass in the brain was expanding. Treya started taking Decadron, a powerful steroid that would control the brain swelling for perhaps a month or two. At the end of that time, it would cease being effective. At the end of that time, Treya's brain tissue would continue being smashed and destroyed. Rapid loss of function would ensue, and the pain would grow unbearable, making continuous morphine delivery a necessity. So that's her situation at this point. So she has now brain surgery to remove this mass. There's gradually more and more agony. Her body and her emotions that you can imagine when the brain being affected are affected. So she makes up her mind to die. Apparently she could have gone into the hospital and lived for a few months more with, all kinds of stuff, but she decides she doesn't want to do that. So he asks her to give him a week. And she says yes. And the rest of this, I'm going to do a lot of reading because I think their own words are a lot better than mine. That is, if I can do it. We'll see. Okay, so he has to pick her up to carry her upstairs. And she says, "Wait, sweetheart, I want to write something in my journal." I got her a journal and a pen, and in clear, bold words she wrote, "It takes grace, yes, and grit." She looked at me. "Understand?" "I think so." I paused for a long time. It wasn't necessary to say what I thought. She knew. The noble Goethe had a beautiful line, "All things ripe want to die." Treya was ripe, and she wanted to die. As I watched her write that entry, what I was thinking, what I didn't have to say was, that summarizes her entire life. Grace and grit, being and doing, equanimity and passion, surrender and will, total acceptance and fierce determination. Those two sides of her soul, the two sides she had wrestled with all her life, the two sides she had finally brought together into one harmonious whole, that was the last message she wanted to leave. I had seen her bring those two sides together. I had seen that balanced harmony pervade all aspects of her life. I had seen that passionate equanimity come to define her very soul. Her one major overriding life goal she had accomplished, and that accomplishment had been brutally tested in circumstances that would simply shatter a lesser realization. She had done that, she was ripe with that wisdom, and she wanted to die. I carried dearest Treya up the stairs for the last time. So she asked him to find her after she's gone, and she seems very, very insistent on this, and he promises that he will. So the family gathers on this night, and the wind in Boulder suddenly goes to 115 miles an hour, and the house is being battered, and everything is happening. So her family's there, and her closest friends and Ken. So everybody in the room was completely there and present for Treya. Then the entire room began to cry. I was holding her hand with my other hand over her heart. My body began to shake violently. It had finally happened. I could not stop shaking. I whispered in her ear the few key phrases from the Book of the Dead. Recognize the clear light as your own primordial mind. Recognize you are now one with enlightened spirit. But mostly we all cried. The best, the strongest, the most enlightened, the most honest, the most beautiful, the most inspiring, the most virtuous, the most cherished person I had ever known had just died. Somehow I felt that the universe would never be the same. Exactly 5 minutes after her death, Michael said, listen to that. The gale force winds had completely ceased blowing, and the atmosphere was a perfect calm. This too was dutifully noted in the next day's papers, right to the exact minute. The ancients have a saying, when a great soul dies, the winds go wild. The greater the soul, the greater the wind necessary to carry it away. Perhaps it was all coincidence, but I couldn't help thinking a great, great soul had died, and the wind responded. And then the last piece. Okay. So, and there it was. That was exactly why she had so insistently asked me to promise that I would find her. It wasn't that she needed me to find her. It was that through my promise to her, she would therefore find me and help me yet again and again and again. I had it all backwards. I thought my promise was how I would help her, whereas it was actually how she would reach and help me again and again and forever again, as long as it took for me to awaken, as long as it took for me to acknowledge, as long as it took for me to realize the spirit that she had come so clearly to announce. And by no means just me. Treya came for all her friends, for her family, and especially for those stricken with terrible illness. For all of this, Treya was present. So, thank you all. I think that is the last, yes. So as you can see, it's an amazing book in many ways. Well, I'm amazed I got through it.